All right, y'all, it is Friday afternoon and I want to go home for a 3-day weekend, but I got to get y'all this lesson about the brain. So let's dive on in, okay? We're covering the brain, like the parts of the brain today. We're going to do some drawing. We're going to talk about the different structures in the brain. So stick with me, pause it as you need to, okay? When I show you the picture of the brain, how does it make you feel? Is it gross? Is it pretty? Is it beautiful? Do you want to poke it? Okay? This is what humans are. This is what we are, okay? Everything about your personality, your skills, your ability comes from this thing inside of your head. If you put your hands like this together, that's roughly the size of your brain, and your brain is who you are, okay? So there are 3 parts to the brain, okay? The first part we're going to talk about is called the brain stem. Okay, imagine that your brain here was like a flower, right? The stem is the part that comes up from your spinal cord. Then you have the midbrain. It's called the midbrain because it's in the middle. And then on the top here, part 3 is the cerebrum, or the cerebral cortex. We're going to go through each of these parts and talk about what structures are within each region. So first off, the oldest part of the brain, the part of the brain that even reptiles, they have a brain stem. Reptiles, they don't have a cerebrum. Dogs don't have a big cerebral cortex, but reptiles and lizards and frogs, even they have a brain stem. The brain stem that even fish have is the part of the brain that keeps you alive. So a few parts. If you will, please circle the term medulla. The medulla oblongata. If you've seen The Water Boy, you've heard of the medulla. Incorrect, by the way, what they say in that movie about the medulla oblongata. We'll come back to that. The medulla is where the spinal cord enters the skull. It's in charge of the involuntary, meaning the autonomic structures of your brain, such as your breathing, your heart rate, your blood pressure. The way I remember this, 2 things. 1, if something happens to your medulla, you're in trouble. Well, medulla reminds me of Medusa. If you looked at Medusa, what would happen to you? You would turn to stone. No more heart rate, no more breathing. Same thing if something happens to your medulla oblongata. Okay, over here on the right, when I see medulla, I also think about a metal. Well, what part of your body does a metal rest on? It rests above your heart. It rests above your lungs. That's what the medulla does. Your breathing and your heart rate. It's in charge of keeping you alive. The next thing that is in the brainstem is called the pons. Whenever I say pons, I say it as if I was yawning. Pons. Because it's in charge of your sleeping and your dreaming. Third part, maybe one of the most important parts, if you will actually put a star by this part. They love to ask about it on the AP exam. The cerebellum. Cerebellum is in charge of a couple things. It's in charge of your muscles. So your muscle memory, called your procedural memory. It's also in charge of your hand-eye coordination and your balance. Okay? That's what the cerebellum does. To be the belle of the ball, your cerebellum has to be working well. It's in charge of all of your movement, the cerebellum. So, don't test yourself. We're moving right along here. Let's go on to part 2, the midbrain. The midbrain, okay? So one thing in the midbrain is called the limbic system. You're gonna wanna put a star by this too. There's gonna be a lot of stuff to star today. The limbic system is in charge of your brain's emotions. So the way I remember this is, have you ever seen little kids play the limbo? Like have a limbo contest? It never ends well because they get so emotional. They get competitive, they get mad. You know, kid starts to cheat, they get all upset. The limbic system is emotional. It's about your emotions. So the first thing is called this is a fun word, say amygdala. Amygdala. The amygdala is about being, it kind of looks like the word angry. It is in charge of your negative emotions, being afraid, being mad, okay? The reason why the news says things on purpose to make you angry, to make you mad, is because they want to trigger your amygdala and your limbic system, because that's what's going to keep you watching, okay? That's why movies with those soundtracks in the backgrounds are so intense, because it gets your amygdala activated. You get afraid by what you see. The hippocampus is another part of the brain, hippocampus. It's shaped like a seahorse. Hippocampus comes from the Greek root for seahorse. Percy Jackson people, you may know about the hippocampi. Okay? The hippocampus is in charge of memories. Okay? I love this mnemonic. If you saw a hippo on campus, you would never forget it. You would remember seeing a hippocampus. See what I did there? It's in charge of your memory. The thalamus, okay? We call it the sensory switchboard. The thalamus is the part of the midbrain where your vision goes to, sound goes to, touch goes to the thalamus. It's called the sensory switchboard. And here's what that means. Oh no, I don't have my picture. Back in the day, there used to be phone operators where like everyone in a town, if they needed to call someone, people didn't have numbers. They'd have to open up the phone and they have to say, hey, I would like to call Mr. Palmer, please. And there would be a switchboard operator on the other line. And they'd say, hold on 1 second. And they would connect the wires between your house and Mr. Palmer's house. And when the wires were connected, you could then send your message to Mr. Palmer. But the operator was in charge of making sure that the right information got to the right place. That's what the thalamus does. It's in charge of your senses, making sure that the right signals end up in the right place in the brain, okay? The sensory switchboard. The hypothalamus, okay, hypo means below. So if we say you have hypothermia, what's the problem with your temperature? It's too low. Hypo, below. Hypoglycemic has to do with having low blood sugar. Hypothalamus is below the thalamus. So this is an important part of your sense process. The hypothalamus, we've already talked about before, it is that master gland in charge of the endocrine system, okay? So it is located in this middle region, the midbrain or the forebrain, okay, region 2. Here's a check for understanding for you. What is the way that you can remember these structures? What does the limbic system do? What do you think the most important part of the brain stem is? So those are those first couple slides, that part of the brain in the very back, the very bottom that even the alligators and fish have that keeps you alive. And then of course, what's the most important part of the midbrain? Out of all these things we just talked about, which of these do you think is the most important? Okay. Pause it, make sure you can answer those questions. All right, we're moving on to the outermost portion of the brain, the part that makes us human. It's called the cerebrum, or sometimes it's called the cerebral cortex. Those terms mean the same thing, okay? It's the part of your brain that you think about when you think about the brain. It's the brainy brain part, okay? So here is my, one of my many brains. Some of you are gonna be in my classroom soon, okay? So here's a brain here. All right, the brain is made up of 2 hemispheres. They're not identical, right? They each have special jobs that we'll talk about, but 2 different hemispheres or half spheres. That's what that term means, hemispheres. Each hemisphere does something a little bit different. The left hemisphere with that L sound is in charge of language, meaning speech, hearing people talking, producing speech, reading. It's also in charge of logic. So the left part of the brain is the math part of the brain, the school part of the brain. In contrast, the right half of the brain is more about your emotional side. I love this graphic so much because you can see the left side, it's analytic, reasoning, science, strategy, control. But the right half of the brain, look at these wonderful values. We have freedom, passion, creative, peace, yearning, all those neat things, poetry, love. Those emotions come from the right half of the brain. Both parts are similarly important, but your brain does specialize a little bit, okay? Now within each hemisphere, there are 4 lobes, okay? So we're gonna go over these in a second, but they are the frontal lobe, F, frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe, okay? So together, F-P-O-T, F-pot, frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. That's the way you can remember these. And each lobe has special areas that do special things that we're going to talk about. And I'm actually going to ask y'all to draw a little version of the brain here in just a minute, okay? Before we do that, can you think of a mnemonic, maybe a sentence that starts with those letters F-P-O-T to help you remember the 4 lobes? So if you can come up with a clever little sentence, that'll be great for us. Question number 2, personal question. Are you more left brain? Are you more logical and analytic? Or are you more of a right brain person? Question 3, Make sure you understand what is it about the human brain that makes us different from other primates and mammals and reptiles. Which of the three reasons? Is it the brainstem, the midbrain, or the cerebral cortex? What makes us human? Okay, make sure that you understand that concept. So here is the brain. Okay, so quick thing. This is the cerebellum down here. The cerebellum is in the back of the brain, right? It's in the brainstem, the hindbrain area. You know, in charge of those motor skills, motor movements. That's near where the medulla is, even lower down here, right? The medulla and the pons. That's the back of the brain. So is this brain facing to the left or facing to the right? Well, this is a right-facing brain. How about this one? This is a left-facing brain, meaning the largest lobe is the frontal lobe. So this blue lobe represents someone kind of looking to the left with the cerebellum in the back. How about this brain? Where is it facing? Well, over here to the right. This would be the frontal lobe, okay? And how about this gooey one that we started off looking at? Well, cerebellum's in the back, so this person would be facing left, and this would be our frontal lobe here. You should be able to identify where the lobes are. So I'm gonna ask you to draw your own version of the brain. If you need to pause me, get some copy paper, some markers, some colored pencils out, I want you to draw the brain. So first off, it looks kind of like a jelly bean or a lima bean, but you do want to make sure that you have the cerebellum down here, right? So this would be a person kind of facing to the right. It looks like a wig, right? Facing to the right, a bad men's wig, okay? So once you have your brain kind of drawn out, go ahead and divide up the 4 lobes. So we have the frontal lobe, parietal, temporal, and occipital. Or we're going to do a slide on each of the lobes and talk about what each lobe does and specializes in, okay? So frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, FPOT. Great. Mr. Jones, why is there a picture from Sparta, from the movie 300? Okay, this is really bad, this is really lame, but one of my classes one year came up with this. Are you familiar with I Am Sparta? Okay, I Am Sparta. Well, the mnemonic that we use for the brain is not I Am Sparta, it's BFM Spabtal. Sparta, Spabtal. Yeah, it's really bad, okay? If you can come up with a better mnemonic, please, please, please help me out, okay? But these letters each stand for a different part of the brain. BFM, Spabtal. These are the 4 lobes and the 6 cortices. The plural of cortex is cortices that you need to know about, okay? So let's go through each one. So we're gonna start off with a slide about the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe, if you ever think really hard and you put your hand on your head, good job. You're actually massaging your frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is in charge of thinking. It's in charge of you making decisions, speaking. It's also in charge of your movement. So the special areas, first off, you have the Broca's area, and I'll show you where in a second on your drawing. You should put the Broca's area. The Broca's area is in charge of your speaking. Circle it, put a star by Broca's area. They love to ask about it. I know it will be on the test because I finally made your test. If your Broca is Boca, no. If your Boca is Broca, you know Spoka. Oh man. Broca's area, it's in charge of your speaking, okay? If your Boca, your mouth, if your Boca is Broca, you know Spoka, okay. Moving on. Also in the frontal lobe, your motor cortex. Motor, M-O, motor means to move your body, okay? And then also in your frontal lobe is something called the prefrontal cortex, which is in charge of your personality and your ability to make rational decisions. If you've ever learned about people with psychopathy, psychopaths, it says they have an underdeveloped frontal lobe. They have a frontal lobe problem. Specifically, their prefrontal cortex has not fully developed. Do y'all know when the prefrontal cortex develops? It's not totally developed until about the time you turn 25. I love being in a classroom with a motion detector for the lights. Hold on. All right, here's where your images should be. Okay, we have the prefrontal cortex. This is where your morals are. When you make bad decisions, just smack yourself in the prefrontal cortex. So take a look, frontal lobe on your drawing. You should do the prefrontal cortex at the very, very, very front of your forehead in your brain. I have number 1 right here, the Broca's area is what I said was number 1 in charge of speaking. You can draw it in there. And then over here, this little strip is number 3. That is your motor cortex. And make sure that it's right up against the parietal lobe. because that'll matter for our next slide. Okay, so make sure you're updating your drawing as we go. So number one, this is Broca's area. Okay. Number two, which is the frontal lobe in general. And then number three, this is the motor cortex. Okay. And then the prefrontal cortex in charge of your morals. Let's talk about the next lobe, the parietal. Everyone say parietal. Parietal reminds me of piranhas for two reasons. One, parietal kind of sounds like piranha. Nice little Finding Nemo reference over here. But parietal is in charge of pain. In fact, it's in charge of any sensation, any kind of physical feeling. So if you were bit by a piranha right here, it would be biting your parietal lobe, and that's where you'd be feeling it in your parietal lobe. It is in charge of your senses. So you know what it works closely with? A good old sensory switchboard. It works closely with the thalamus, right? That operator sending the right signals to the right places, okay? So on your brain, parietal lobe is going to be on the top, right? And then to go ahead and add in number 4, it's right next to the motor cortex, the somatosensory cortex, and they work together, y'all, because movement and sensation are so closely related, right? I have to be able to feel this pen in order to be able to move it, right? If I'm throwing a baseball, I have to be able to feel it in my fingertips, right? The sensation in my fingertips, afferent neurons go up to the sensory cortex, and now I'm ready to throw that thing and use my muscles. Well, the motor cortex is going to be in charge of making sure that I am moving my body the right way. So those two cortices, they work together very closely. Y'all are doing great. You can do this. Next lobe. We talked frontal, we talked parietal. In the back of your brain is what's called the occipital lobe. Sounds like an X sound. Occipital. OCC. I love that because literally it is in charge of you being able to see. This is where your vision is managed in your brain. Okay, the occipital lobe. Little Great Gatsby reference down here with the eyes, right? Have you ever heard the expression that someone has eyes in the back of their head? Okay, this is a super creepy tattoo, right? To the back of his head. He grew his hair out to look like a mustache. You literally have your vision in the back of your head. That's why if someone's ever smacked you upside the back of the head, or if you've ever fallen and hit the back of your head, for a second you're seeing stars, right? Or it goes dark, because literally the part of your brain in charge of vision, it is being damaged when you hit the back of your head, okay? So make sure that you label number 7 down here is the visual cortex. It is the main cortex you need to know in the occipital lobe. Okay, so we got frontal, parietal, occipital. Hopefully you've been labeling your graph as we go. The last lobe is the temporal lobe. Temporal or temporal. It has the word tempo in it. I know a lot of y'all are orchestra people. I know we have some chorus folks and some band folks. Tempo is the sound, the beat. Guess what the temporal lobe does? It's in charge of hearing. Okay? Both sounds as well as speech. There's a special area. Remember how Broca's area was in charge of your boca, your speaking? Well, German guy, it's pronounced Wernicke, right? But spelled with a W. Wernicke's area is in the temporal lobe. It's in charge of listening to language. So when we draw Wernicke's area, we're going to put it pretty close to the frontal lobe where that Broca's area is. And what I actually did is I kind of drew a dotted line here. So here, number 10, I know it's hard to see, but right there is Wernicke's area in charge of understanding speech, right? It's connected to Broca's area. Those are the two parts of your brains that deal with language. And then number 9, we added in, it's just called the auditory cortex. Auditory means having to do with sound, audio, okay? So you should, by this point, have a beautiful brain, all labeled with BFM Spavtal. The Broca's area, speaking, frontal lobe, motor cortex, right? Those 3 go together. And then you have the sensory cortex and the parietal lobe, those go together. The visual cortex and the occipital lobe, those go together. And then in the temporal lobe, you have the auditory cortex and Wernicke's area, okay? 10 parts of the brain, and this is a really cool graphic. It shows which parts of the brain are in charge of certain actions, okay? So is this person facing to the left or facing to the right? Well, which lobe is in the back of your head? I said you have your eyes in the back of your head. So this would be the back lobe. It's in charge of vision. So back here, we have the occipital lobe, right? Occipital lobe. So all of this large portion up here, all this is the frontal lobe. It's in charge of your personality and your morals, and of course, your movement, right? The motor cortex, your emotions, all that stuff's in the frontal lobe. Right here where it says, I feel, that's the parietal lobe, specifically the somatosensory cortex, right? It's in charge of your senses. And then down here, this area is part of your listening ability, your hearing ability, the temporal lobe, and then, so technically, I guess this would be like Broca's area. So this is kind of maybe the one part that I wish was a little closer to the frontal lobe for this to be a perfect brain graphic. But this is what your brain does. So many things. It specializes in different areas. You have the left hemisphere with language. The right hemisphere is more creative, artistic, but it's an amazing thing, and we will keep talking about it as we go forward. Appreciate you all. Email me, send me my message if you have any questions at all. Peace out.